Okay, good afternoon everyone. As you can tell from my presentation, the title of my project is The Neoliberal Privatization in Kosovo, a Deconstructed Myth. This is my project for the Honor Society here at A.U.K. I hope that by the end of the presentation you will be able to at least deconstruct my title, so don't be afraid if it sounds too complicated in the beginning. This is basically the agenda that was constructed around the chapters of my work. The first two parts of my presentation include the background chapters. The first one has to deal with privatization and its roots. The second one deals with Kosovo and being made to believe a myth. Then I will discuss the methodology used in this study. I will present some of the results of the study. I will have an analysis and discussion, and then at the end I have some conclusions and recommendations, and at the very end I have the bibliography. So, in order to understand what this so-called myth is, we need to first understand what this myth, how this myth is actually defined, and how privatization is defined is a really understandable concept. I have a definition up there, but in general, privatization is the act of transferring an asset from a publicly or socially owned into private hands. So basically taking it from the state and giving it to a private owner. It is very important to understand that privatization has to deal with ownership, and the concept of ownership is the one that is going to later explain the whole point of privatization. But the definition of privatization does not itself per se explain the reasons as to why some asset needs to be privatized, it needs to be transferred into private hands. So, in order to understand that, we need to look at the ideology that explains and promotes privatization today, which is neoliberalism. Please understand that privatization started way earlier, way before neoliberalism. There were privatization of assets even in the ancient Rome. But today, after I can say 70s and 80s, the primary economic ideology that operates in the world and that promotes privatization is neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? In my slides you can see a brief explanation or description of the ideology given by Professor David Harvey in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, which is mainly an economic and political ideology which promotes the individual rights, individual property, free market. So basically neoliberalism says that the state should keep his hands out of the market. Laissez-faire, the most extreme state of laissez-faire. Let them free. So, what are the main components of neoliberalism? First, it is this perspective of individual, society, and the state. Neoliberals would say that individuals should be not constrained by the society or the state, it should be let free, and he or she should achieve his potential in the best possible way, by being free. Another component of neoliberalism is efficiency. Neoliberals promote privatization of assets because they say that the state is not a profit maximization, is not someone who seeks profit maximization. So we should leave this to individuals because they seek profit maximization, and in the process they're going to increase efficiency. Another thing is that they go even that far that say that it's not that we're leaving only this to the individual, but the individual, by pursuing his profit maximization, is going to save the society from the tragedy of the commons. What is the tragedy of the commons? It is that when something belongs to everyone, no one is going to take responsibility for that asset. So, if an individual has that asset, he is going to maintain it in a proper way, make a profit for himself, but also help the society in general. Nevertheless, there are some paradoxes of neoliberalism which really are paradoxes of privatization. And the first one is that the neoliberals tell you that you should say no to the state in good times, but what happens in practice in bad times, you have these very same people that blame the governments, that blame the state, and ask from the governments and the state to support these enterprises. A good example is the last financial crisis, in which many governments throughout the world had to intervene and to rescue these enterprises. Another paradox is efficiency. Efficiency may lead to profit maximization, but remember when we talked about ownership, who is going to benefit from that efficiency and from that profit maximization? It's going to benefit the private owner, the person who has privatized that enterprise. Also, the invisible hand, which is a pre-neoliberal or classical idea of Adam Smith, which presumes that when somebody pursues his self-interest, then the society is going to benefit also, because each individual is going to pursue that. But there is also a paradox within that, because this assumes that the society consists of a group of individuals. But what about the relationships among these individuals? I can live in the same neighborhood, in the same community, in the same society with Bill Gates. He can be pursuing his self-interest and making a profit. I can be pursuing survival, basically. So, and on the other hand, we have Karl Marx, who says that we need to look at the relationships among individuals in a society, and the sum of those relationships is going to present a society, is going to represent that society. So basically, we have also another example that shows these paradoxes, and it is the intention to privatize world's water by Nestle. It was a very famous statement made by the CEO of Nestle, who said that water should not be a human right, but instead it should be privatized. Why? Because we are a private company, we are going to raise efficiency, rationalize water, etc. But at the end of the day, who is this guy so that the whole world should trust that he's going to discipline us and make the whole process more efficient? Anyways, this is basically the background information that we need to understand before we go and look at the case of Kosovo. And the case of Kosovo, we started this from 1912, when Kosovo was separated from Albania in the Conference of London. In 1913, Kosovo remained officially under the first Yugoslavia. And how was the economic condition in Kosovo from this period until 1989? I can say that Kosovo was partially industrialized in the late 70s and 80s, but in general, Kosovo was the poorest region in Yugoslavia, which consisted of 6 republics and 2 regions, Kosovo and Vojvodina, and even the minerals and even the rich resources that were in Kosovo, they were sold at a very cheap price, and they really served for other republics. Nevertheless, Kosovo was partially industrialized and achieved some sort of a progress. But in 1989, you have Milosevic, who comes to power, and he starts this process of privatization. But before that, in 1982, we have a typical neoliberal organization, International Monetary Fund, that conditioned Yugoslavia for support by making Yugoslavia to transform from a socialist federation into a free market economy. Milosevic continued these policies with privatization, and he also had some problems, in particular with Albanian workers. Within a few years, 145,000 workers were fired. The privatization process continued in the 90s as well, where Serbs were permitted to privatize socially owned assets, but Albanians were not permitted to do such a thing. And eventually, all this process led to war. The war in 1998, 1999, and then after the war, we have also some figures that show the condition of these enterprises. According to studies made after the war, it is estimated that the war has caused a damage in socially owned enterprises of 1.3 billion Deutschmarks at that time, which is a pretty high amount. Also, nevertheless, despite these damages, 75% of these enterprises were still functioning, and there was hope for these to be revitalized. Then, 192 medium to big enterprises, which consist of 55% of the total number of socially owned enterprises, had a value of 4.5 billion Deutschmarks, which is a pretty high amount for Kosovo. So half of them had this amount. So nevertheless, despite damages, despite all that, there was hope to revitalize the economy of Kosovo. But what happened after the war? We have the international community who installed its protectorate in Kosovo, and we have the fourth pillar of UNMIK, which stated that the main program that they're going to use is a massive program of privatization. This program was used not only to help the economy of Kosovo, but was used also to build the whole state of Kosovo. So the main tool that they used was the privatization. So far there have been 60 waves of privatization with two methods, basically spin-off, special spin-off, and liquidation. So, in general, this is the background information, and now let's move on to the methodology. Since we have some constraints to this study, I had to focus mainly on the post-war period and mainly on two enterprises, one of them which is already privatized, Kosovo Energy Distribution and Supply, KETS, and the attempt to privatize post and telecommunication in Kosovo. The population and sample, how did I pick this? There were around 600 socially owned enterprises and 25 publicly owned enterprises. KETS and PTK are 2 out of the 9 critical and crucial public enterprises in Kosovo. So these two are considered to have a strategic importance for the economy of Kosovo, hence I picked these two. Data collection was done basically by primary data, 2 interviews, and by secondary data, online research. My interviewees, one of them was heavily involved in the attempt to privatize PTK, hence he asked to be anonymous in this study. The other interviewee did not have a problem with that, but I decided to have both of them to keep anonymity of them and use nicknames, the first one being the professor, because he's a professor of economics, and the second one being a manager, because he's a manager of some enterprise today. The analysis is made through 2 main strategies, by looking at the patterns as a result of common ideas and common stands and deviations, differences, counter-arguments, both objective and subjective. I have several limitations, of course, the time, because we had to submit different parts of the project within certain time limit, lack of data. This whole process of privatization does not have really credible data that I could use during the study. Lack of information accessibility. I contacted, for example, the Agency for Privatization in Kosovo. They never replied. After a long period of time, they replied and said, no, you cannot come to interview us, but you can simply send us some questions. I sent them the questions, but I received partial answers only for 2 out of 6 questions that I sent them. And those answers didn't really have to do anything with the questions that I asked. Topic sensitivity. This is a pretty sensitive topic. We need to understand that a couple of years ago, the chairman of the privatization agency in Kosovo, Dino Asonaj, was said to have committed suicide after he had stabbed himself 9 times. So we need to understand that this is a very sensitive topic. So the other part has to deal with the results. The first being the results from the primary data, with the interviews that I did with the manager and the professor. Again, these are nicknames. And the second part of the results consists of my online research that I did mainly on these 2 enterprises. First, the privatization of KETS. We need to understand that KETS is one of the greatest employers in Kosovo, still, even after privatization. In 2008, government came up with a decision to privatize this enterprise, always saying that we need to increase the efficiency of this enterprise. In 2012, Limak and Chalik, a consortium, was declared as the winner, which offered 26.3 million euros. The second case is the attempt to privatize PTK. PTK was established in 1959. Again, it was one of the companies that was hit in the 90s by the regime of Milosevic. Its workers were fired during that time. In 2008, again, the government made a decision to privatize 75% of this enterprise for the sum of an estimate was of 270 million to 300 million euros. So, at the end of this process, the government announced a German company, Axos Capital, as the winner that had offered this amount of money. Nevertheless, the members of the Assembly of Kosovo did not vote on this because they said that it was underestimated. This was not the real value of PTK. And the second reason was that they suspected the very existence of this company, Axos Capital. It was even referred to as a fictive company. There were suspicions that was somebody within the government that had created this phantom company to privatize and make PTK for its own enterprise. They said they gave an address of this company. When journalists went to Germany and looked at the address, it was a private house. It was not a company at all. So, this is basically the results and analysis and discussion of the results. We need to understand that privatization is political, despite the fact that neoliberals would tell us that it's not political, it's just an economic matter of thing. Government is always involved, and those free marketeers are as political as anyone else. This is a statement made by Professor Ha-Joon Chang in his book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. So we need to understand that the process is political itself. And what are the examples? In our case, cats. From 1999 until 2011, over 180 million euros were invested in the energy network. From 2007 until 2012, over 55 million euros were invested in the energy network. In 2013, CAS was privatized by 26.3 million euros. What is the economic rationale for doing this transaction? There is none. It is a political decision. Also, the case of PTK. PTK had times where its dividends was 60 million euros. This means that within 5 years you can get the value for which you want to privatize PTK. And they wanted to privatize PTK so that they could use 180 million to build the highway. So wait 3 years, and you're going to get that amount and build the highway, and you don't have to sell PTK at all. The second thing that I encountered in the study was that there is no win-win situation. They tell you that the individual wins, the society wins, etc. But in the case of cats, they privatize it to increase efficiency, but after they privatize it, the price has increased twice. First, it increased by 10%, the second time it increased by 5.13%. So, you are privatizing to increase efficiency so that efficiency can decrease the costs, and you're also increasing the price. This means you're increasing your profit, reducing costs and increasing the price. You're generating more revenue. But how are citizens benefiting from that? We have still power shortages in most rural areas, and we're still paying a higher amount for that. In the case of PTK, the government's invisible hand in Axos Capital, it was also a very suspicious case where the government itself wanted, or some officials within the government, it was suspected that they wanted to privatize PTK for themselves. Another aspect, and a very important one, that is not discussed by the neoliberals, it is the condition of the workers after privatization. So, what happens to the workers after privatization? First of all, workers versus the owners. Who loves the enterprise more? Who dedicates himself or herself to the enterprise more? For the owner, for the private owner, as soon as the value of the enterprise is increased, the owner can sell it. Look at the stock markets, the value of my enterprise increased, I'm going to sell it. For the workers, it is much harder for them to move from one place to another, to leave their families, or to have to move their families to different places. So workers have this connection with their working places, and it is very important to look at their conditions after privatization. What happened after privatization? 20% of the value, according to our agency, privatization agency, 20% of the value for which these enterprises are being privatized need to go and to be redistributed among the workers. What has happened? This is the 20% of the value of which the enterprise is being sold, not the real asset value of the enterprise. So there is a glitch in here. Also, we have cases when this 20% has not been distributed at all. For example, in the case of the factory of steel tubes, we have workers of this factory that have been on a strike over 200 days right in front of the government building. They have not received this money. Also, another thing that describes the conditions of the workers who are citizens of Kosovo after privatization. The case of compressor. Compressor was a technical and an enterprise that dealt with cars, fixing cars, repairing cars, and making the technical control. It had over 50 workers before it was privatized. After it was privatized, from that enterprise it changed to a restaurant, and it has 15 workers during the summer when there are weddings. So we can see how the number has decreased. What are the conclusions and recommendations? Well, the first conclusion is that neoliberalism's claim to depoliticize the transactions and to depoliticize markets is a political statement itself. It just belongs to a different kind, it represents a different kind of interest, but it is a political one. We also can conclude that privatization has not led to development, which is well-being. Now, there is a difference between development and growth. What about growth? Well, even growth can be put to doubt, because the fund that has been raised by privatization has not been circulated in the economy of Kosovo. Once again, the privatization has not been beneficial to the general society. Another conclusion is that publicly owned enterprises, which are not many, again there were 25 and out of them 9 are with strategic importance for Kosovo, should be under the ownership of the people of Kosovo. They should still continue to belong to the whole society of Kosovo. CAT's efficiency may have increased, but so have the prices. So citizens are not really enjoying this benefit that the neoliberals claim, that not only the individual who privatizes it, but the society is going to benefit from that as well. PTK is also a national asset which is more worth than selling it to build a highway. If you maintain PTK, then PTK can be used, then its dividends can be used to build highways and different projects as well. And another conclusion, and this is the last conclusion, is that the economic development of Kosovo should not be dependent nor prevented by privatization in Kosovo. So far we have seen privatization as the main economic tool used by first the international community, second the governments of Kosovo. So this was presented as the only option that we had to develop our economy. Based on these conclusions, we have a number of recommendations, and the first one, the Assembly of Kosovo should create an auditing committee which will evaluate the whole privatization process after the war. This committee should be given the right to evaluate every single socially owned and publicly owned company, enterprise, and in case they see that there has been, the requirements have not been fulfilled, then they should have the right to renationalize those assets. Second recommendation is a law that recognizes and protects publicly owned enterprises which have a strategic importance for Kosovo. We don't have many, again, we had 9. So, enterprises like Trepča and Mitrovica, enterprises like PTK here in Pristina should be protected by a law. And the third recommendation, it's also important for these publicly owned enterprises to be managed by the Assembly of Kosovo and not simply the government. One of the excuses for selling PTK was that PTK was overemployed. But PTK was under the control of the government, so who employed those people? It was the government that employed those people. So the assembly should have a say in those enterprises rather than the government. And the last recommendation here is that the privatization agency of Kosovo should not be allowed to manage socially owned enterprises nor publicly owned enterprises. This agency has way too many affairs and it should be shut down as soon as possible. So basically, this is my presentation. Here is a bibliography and that's it. Thank you. Feel free if you have any questions. I would be very disappointed to get no questions, please.
Do you not still think that shutting down the agency for privatization is a very harsh measure?
When we take such a decision, we need to look at the costs and benefits of such a transaction. The privatization agency of Kosovo has had way too many affairs, that the cost of maintaining it is much higher than shutting it down. As I said earlier, the chairman of this organization committed suicide by stabbing himself 9 times. Now come on, we all understand that it is almost impossible for a human being to stab himself 9 times. So this agency is way too suspicious to be given all the trust and to let this agency manage with the public wealth. And there are rumors lately that there is a high possibility to shut down this agency.
You said that the agency should be replaced by a committee that should evaluate the entire privatization process. But who do you think should run that committee? Should it be independent or run by the international community? How do you think it might be able for that committee to withhold transparency?
First of all, I don't think that the committee should be initiated based on ethnic background. This is a really big problem in Kosovo. You're an international, I'm going to trust you more. No, we have seen that A.U.K is as corrupt as our own judges. This committee should consist of members from all political parties in the Assembly of Kosovo, which then will form teams of experts that will evaluate that. So basically the committee is just going to run the political part of this and then hire experts that can evaluate each single case of privatization that has happened after the war. So I'm not saying that to transfer all the competencies that were given to the agency of privatization, but just to stop this process, freeze it for a moment, and reevaluate what has happened in Kosovo.
But what about the political will? Are they willing to form the committee, given that, you know, you said before that these enterprises were privatized and there was a political agenda behind? How do you think this will work? Can it be put in practice?
This is a good question, since it is very difficult to convince the same politicians who have used these very same policies that their policies have been wrong. Especially due to the fact that they have benefited from these policies. But I think that there is a goodwill in the Assembly of Kosovo that has or will initiate such a committee, and it should remain to the public opinion pressure to make them form such a committee. I don't think that the committee itself is the solution for what has happened in Kosovo, but the committee will be like the judge who is going to come and bring us some official report and tell us that this process has had these flaws. So let's change the way we are basically governing the economy of Kosovo. It is also very important to mention that when they said that they should privatize PTK, they were blaming the fact that there were way too many workers employed there. but the government was the one that has been running PTK. So who employed those many workers? Also, when they say that PTK is not efficient enough, well, if PTK is not efficient enough and the government is failing, you don't have to sell it. You can simply privatize a management team, bring it to PTK, and let this team to run the enterprise. It is the same as saying the owner of the house is not maintaining the house, let's sell the house. No, let's change the owner of the house. That's the counter-argument. And with a private management team, if the problem is because it is being mismanaged by the government, a private management team would serve just like in different corporations, if you will. You would have the state, the public, who is the owner, who is the stockholder of the enterprise, and you would have the management team, the CEOs and all that will run the day-to-day operations and be responsible for what is happening in that enterprise.